Well, when President Obama cut funding to the shuttle program, he opened the door for the private sector to step in. This latest launch from the Orbital Science Corporation was a big step forward in the private space race and exactly the boost that NASA was hoping for. Not only will it guarantee future price competition, but it also safeguards the ISS since it will no longer be dependent on one company or a foreign government for supplies. So what does that mean for space exploration moving forward? Well, to discuss this tech advance, I'm joined now by Keith Cowing. He's the editor at NASAWatch.com. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So talk about this. This is exactly what NASA wanted, right? Competition in the private space field?
Well, absolutely. The more ways you have to get to space, the more flexibility you have. And if one rocket for some reason doesn't work, you've got one or two other backups. So in the past, when there have been problems with the rocket, there's only been one path to get up there, and that causes problems, and it's nice to have this flexibility.
Sure, and that also opens up a flexibility in terms of the locations, as I understand. This one actually launched out of Wallops, Virginia. Mm-hmm. The other ones, they launch usually out of Cape Canaveral, and I know that this this new space company is looking to, or SpaceX anyway, is looking to have one in Texas.
Yes.
So obviously we're not dependent on weather patterns anymore as well, right?
Well, that's one of the reasons actually they're looking at Texas, because the weather is more predictable there. But again, having more rockets in more places at more times gives you much more flexibility than one launch site in Russia, one in the U.S., and one in South America.
Sure. The only problem is going to be getting the supplies to the different places, but that's much better than delaying these things when the supplies are so crucial to the International Space Station. Now, talk about the significance of this rocket. As I understand, it was made from parts from different countries.
Yeah, this is an interesting rocket. The first stage engines are modified versions of what was in the old Soviet moon rocket, which didn't work too well, whereas the engines worked just fine. The first stage is built by the same Ukrainian company that builds the Zenit rocket, which was part of the booster for the Soviet space shuttle, which is now canceled. The second stage was built by another company in the U.S., and the third stage is built by yet another company. So it's like a lot of things these days in a globalized world. You open up a computer and the parts are from 10 different places. But because of standards and interchangeability, that's actually quite doable these days.
And that's not what's happening with a corporation like SpaceX, is it not?
Well, they have the exact, they have an opposite view. They build everything in-house. They first thought, well, yeah, we'll buy the parts here and there, but they realized that what they needed, they had specifications that they wanted to control, and also they could do it cheaper in-house. So the other nice thing about this is there's more than one way to build a rocket, which is also very dynamic and useful if you find out that one component from one country fails and yet SpaceX is making all their own. One more way to be certain you get your rocket to where it needs to go when it needs to go.
And it also makes for price competition in that sense.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about the benefits of having a private space company and some of the drawbacks.
Well, up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, space exploration was something that governments did. Pick your government, it was their rockets. The rockets were often built by private companies, but under very strong control of the government. And what was started 4 or 5 years back was the thought that at least NASA really doesn't need to be a shipping company. It should be out there doing exploration. And it's sort of like exploring the Old West or the Australian outback. Once you've sort of, expanded into the territory, you don't need the government guys out there anymore. You should turn back to the folks who do this commercially and allow them to do the trucking. And that's exactly what you saw just the other day. And it's probably the shape of things to come, because there are other companies lined up to do this, to take not just cargo, but people.
At the same time, I wonder who would be held accountable if a disaster happened. Would it be the private company? Would it be NASA who's commissioning them, or do we know?
That's still a bit of a debate here, but they've worked a lot of these things out. There's a liability waiver that's in place for a lot of these things, but what they've been able to do is build upon what commercial aviation, commercial shipping, and commercial trucking have been able to do. So at the end of the day, if you lose a rocket, it'll be very clear who's at fault and who is not.
Now, what does it take for NASA to trust one of these companies bringing equipment to the International Space Station?
Well, there's a very, very specific set of requirements that as you have your space station, something coming up to it, they have rules that say you can't come any closer unless you can do this, that, and that. You have to be able to stop the spacecraft at a moment's notice. It has to be able to not crash into the station. And they also need to be able to be certain that if a problem does happen, it can automatically depart from the station without human intervention. So they have very strict requirements. It's sort of like, I'm not going to let you park your little car in a space that's a small car unless you have a small car. If you meet that requirement, come on up to the space station.
And finally, we don't have too much time left, but I need to ask, when it comes to these private companies, they're not really at the beckoning call of NASA all the time, right? Are they looking more towards a space exploration of their own?
Oh yeah, both companies are launching private commercial satellites all the time, and this notion that the government subsidized is not the case here. I mean, both companies could stop their work with the government right now and still have a long queue of satellite payloads to launch. So it's sort of the best. It's the best of both worlds. You have a government customer, but you have other customers, and together you get options that you would not otherwise have normally had.
It's a very exciting week for space. The discovery of 3 new planets and that could potentially be habitable. And this launch happening on Sunday. It's a very exciting week. Keith Coing, editor at NASAWatch.com. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.